Imagine standing in a room full of decorated officers, each one looking at you like you don't belong. Your uniform feels too big, your voice seems too small, and everyone around you thinks they know your story better than you do. They whisper about fabricated records, impossible achievements, and the audacity of someone trying to fool the system. But what happens when the most powerful person in that room opens a classified file that no one else has seen? What happens when decades of mockery and disbelief crumble in a single moment? What happens when the truth is so extraordinary that even the skeptics fall silent? This is the story of a woman whose military record was so remarkable that people refused to believe it was real. For years, she endured ridicule, dismissal, and accusations of fraud. Her fellow servicemen laughed at her claims. Her superiors questioned her credibility. Even her own family wondered if she had lost touch with reality. Everyone thought they knew the truth about her service. They were all wrong. What you're about to read will challenge everything you think you know about courage, sacrifice, and the hidden heroes who walk among us. Because sometimes, the most unbelievable stories are the only ones worth believing. Margaret Chin sat in the back row of the Veterans Affairs meeting room, her hands folded tightly in her lap. At 62, she had learned to make herself small, invisible even, especially in rooms like this where her presence seemed to make others uncomfortable. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the faces of the dozen other veterans gathered for their monthly support group meeting. She had been coming to these meetings for 3 years now, ever since her daughter Sarah had practically forced her to attend after finding her mother sitting alone in her apartment, staring at old photographs and barely eating. Margaret knew Sarah meant well, but these gatherings only served to remind her of how different her experience had been from everyone else's. The facilitator, a kind but inexperienced social worker named Jennifer Walsh, was going around the room asking each veteran to share something about their service. Margaret had heard these stories before. Combat tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, the brotherhood of the infantry, the pride of serving alongside fellow soldiers who had your back. Stories that followed familiar patterns, stories that people understood and respected. When it came to Margaret's turn, she usually declined to share. Today felt different, though she couldn't say why. Perhaps it was the new veteran sitting across from her, a young woman named Lisa who looked lost and scared in a way that reminded Margaret of her younger self. "Margaret," Jennifer prompted gently, "would you like to share anything today?" The room grew quiet. Margaret could feel the familiar weight of skeptical attention settling on her shoulders. She had made the mistake of sharing parts of her story before, only to be met with polite smiles that didn't reach anyone's eyes, followed by whispered conversations she wasn't meant to hear. "I serve in places that don't officially exist," Margaret began quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I did things that never happened, with people whose names I'm not allowed to say." A few veterans shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Tom Rodriguez, a former Marine who had done 3 tours in Afghanistan, rolled his eyes almost imperceptibly. Margaret caught the gesture and felt the familiar sting of disbelief. "I understand that sounds dramatic," she continued, her voice growing slightly stronger. "But that's the reality of certain types of military service. There are operations that remain classified decades later, missions that were so sensitive that even acknowledging they happened could compromise national security." "Come on, Margaret," Tom said, not unkindly but with the tired patience of someone who had heard too many tall tales. "We've all signed non-disclosure agreements. We all know about classified operations. But the way you talk about your service, it's like something out of a spy novel." Margaret's cheeks flushed, but she pressed on. "In 1983, I was part of a 6-person team inserted into a Soviet-controlled region of Afghanistan. Our mission was to locate and extract a captured CIA operative who had been gathering intelligence on Soviet military capabilities. The operation lasted 3 weeks and involved crossing through some of the most heavily guarded territory in the world." The room was completely silent now, but not with the respectful attention Margaret had hoped for. She could see the barely concealed skepticism on every face, the way people glanced at each other when they thought she wasn't looking. The extraction was successful, she continued, but we lost 2 team members in the process. Their deaths were never officially acknowledged because the mission never officially happened. Their families were told they died in training accidents. Margaret, Jennifer interrupted gently, these are very serious claims. Are you sure you're not perhaps mixing up different experiences, or maybe remembering things differently than they actually happened? The question hit Margaret like a physical blow. It was the same polite way of calling her a liar that she had heard countless times over the years. People assumed that because she was getting older, because she lived alone, because her story sounded impossible, she must be confused or delusional. I remember everything perfectly, Margaret said, her voice tight with controlled emotion. I remember the weight of the gear we carried, the smell of diesel fuel and unwashed bodies in the transport vehicle, the way the mountains looked in the pre-dawn darkness. I remember the face of the operative we extracted, the way his hands shook when we gave him water, the relief in his voice when he realized we were Americans. Look, no disrespect intended, said another veteran, a former Army sergeant named Mike Stevens, but women weren't allowed in combat roles back then. The military barely let women serve in any meaningful capacity in the 1980s, let alone on some top-secret extraction mission in Afghanistan. Margaret had heard this argument before, and it was the hardest one to counter because it contained just enough truth to sound convincing. Women had indeed faced significant restrictions in military service during the 1980s. Most combat roles were officially closed to them, but what people didn't understand was that certain specialized units operated outside the normal military structure, with their own rules and requirements. You're thinking of conventional military units, Margaret explained. The team I was part of wasn't Army, Navy, Air Force, or Marines in the traditional sense. We were recruited from across all branches and some civilian agencies for specific skill sets. The normal rules didn't apply to us because we didn't officially exist. Tom shook his head with a mixture of pity and frustration. Margaret, do you understand how that sounds? A secret military unit that doesn't follow any rules, recruiting women for combat missions in 1983, operating in Soviet territory without any official record. It's like you're describing something from a movie. I know how it sounds, Margaret replied, her voice barely steady. I've lived with how it sounds for 40 years. Do you think I enjoy being looked at like I'm either lying or crazy? Do you think I choose to have experiences that no one believes? The room fell into an uncomfortable silence. Margaret could see the mixture of pity and doubt on every face around her. These were good people, fellow veterans who had served their country with honor and distinction. But they lived in a world where military service followed recognizable patterns, where heroism came with witnesses and documentation, where sacrifice was acknowledged and honored. Jennifer cleared her throat softly. Margaret, it's important for all of us to feel heard and validated in our experiences. Sometimes, though, our memories can be influenced by movies, books, or stories we've heard. There's no shame in that. It's actually quite common, especially as we get older. The words were spoken with kindness, but they felt like daggers to Margaret. She was being patted on the head and dismissed, treated like an elderly woman whose mind was playing tricks on her. The truth was being explained away as confusion, her actual experiences reduced to the wandering fantasies of someone who had spent too much time alone. I have photographs, Margaret said suddenly, surprising herself with the admission. She had never mentioned the photographs before, had never brought any kind of evidence to these meetings. Something about the young woman Lisa's frightened expression made her want to prove that impossible things could be true, that people could serve their country in ways that defied conventional understanding. Photographs of what? Mike asked, his tone suggesting he was humoring her. Of the mission, of my team, of the extraction point. Margaret reached into her purse and pulled out a small manila envelope that she had carried with her for weeks, never quite finding the courage to open it in front of others. I know I shouldn't have kept these. I know it violated security protocols. but I was 22 years old, and I thought someone should have proof that we existed, that what we did mattered. She pulled out 3 black and white photographs, their edges worn from decades of careful handling. The images were grainy and poorly lit, clearly taken under difficult conditions. They showed what appeared to be military personnel in non-standard gear, faces partially obscured by equipment and shadows. Tom reached for the photographs with the attitude of someone prepared to debunk an obvious fake. He studied them for several long moments, his expression gradually shifting from skepticism to confusion. "These don't look like any military photos I've ever seen," he admitted. "The gear is wrong, the uniforms are weird, and I can't identify half the equipment in the background." "That's because it was specialized equipment, much of it modified or custom-made for specific operations," Margaret explained. "We didn't use standard military issue for anything because standard military issue wasn't designed for the kind of work we did." Mike took the photographs next, examining them with the careful attention of someone who had spent years in the military and knew what authentic documents looked like. "I'll give you this, Margaret. If these are fake, they're incredibly well done. The aging looks right, the photo paper feels authentic, and the image quality is consistent with cameras from that era. But that doesn't prove anything about what they actually show," Tom pointed out. "For all we know, these could be photographs from a movie set or a military training exercise." Margaret felt her heart sink. Even when she provided evidence, it was dismissed or explained away. She understood their skepticism to a point. Her story did sound impossible. The military they knew didn't operate the way she described. But their refusal to even consider the possibility that their understanding might be incomplete felt like a betrayal of everything she had sacrificed. "I received 3 commendations for that mission," she said quietly, putting the photographs back in her purse. "None of them appear in my official military record, because acknowledging them would have compromised operational security. I was told that someday, when enough time had passed and the political situation had changed, the truth about our operations might be declassified. That was 40 years ago." "Margaret," Jennifer said with practiced therapeutic gentleness, "it's clear that your military service is very important to you, and that's wonderful. Service to our country is always meaningful, regardless of the specific role we played. But sometimes we need to be careful about how our memories might be influenced by our desire to feel important or valued." The suggestion that her memories were products of a need to feel important was more insulting than outright accusations of lying. Margaret stood up slowly, gathering her purse and jacket with as much dignity as she could muster. "I understand that my story doesn't fit into the boxes you're familiar with," she said, addressing the room, but looking directly at Jennifer. "I understand that it's easier to believe I'm confused or attention-seeking than to consider that there might be aspects of military service that you're not aware of. But I know what I did, and I know what I sacrificed, and I know that 2 good people died carrying out a mission that mattered, even if you'll never read about it in any history book." She walked toward the door, pausing only when she reached Lisa, the young veteran who had been sitting quietly throughout the entire exchange. "Don't let them convince you that your experience doesn't matter because it doesn't match their expectations," Margaret said softly. "Some stories take longer to be believed, but that doesn't make them less true." As Margaret left the meeting room, she could hear the low murmur of conversation starting up behind her. She knew they were talking about her, probably discussing her mental state and whether someone should contact her family. She had been through this pattern so many times that it felt like a well-worn script. The hallway of the Veterans Affairs building was empty and quiet, her footsteps echoing off the polished linoleum floors. Margaret had spent so many hours in buildings like this over the years, trying to access services and benefits that seemed to assume her military experience had followed conventional patterns. Every form she filled out, every interview she sat through, every meeting she attended seemed designed for people whose service fit into neat, recognizable categories. She pushed through the glass doors and stepped out into the afternoon sunlight, feeling the familiar weight of isolation settle around her shoulders like a heavy coat. The parking lot was half empty, filled with cars that belonged to people whose sacrifices were acknowledged and understood, whose stories were believed and honored. Margaret sat in her car for several minutes before starting the engine, staring at the building she had just left and thinking about all the meetings, interviews, and conversations where her truth had been dismissed or diminished. She thought about her teammates who had died in Afghanistan, whose families still believed they had been killed in training accidents. She thought about the operative they had rescued, who had probably gone on to live a normal life without ever knowing the names of the people who had risked everything to bring him home. Most of all, she thought about the envelope hidden in her bedroom closet, the one that contained official documents she had never shown to anyone. Documents that would prove every word she had spoken was true, but documents that would also violate classification protocols that were still in effect after 40 years. The irony was bitter and familiar. She possessed absolute proof of her service and sacrifices, but producing that proof would itself be an act of treason. She was trapped between being dismissed as a liar and being prosecuted as a traitor, with no middle ground where her truth could exist safely. As Margaret drove home through the suburban streets lined with flag-adorned houses and yellow ribbon magnets supporting the troops, she wondered if there would ever come a day when someone in authority would have the courage and clearance to tell her story properly. Someone who could look at the classified files and speak the words that would finally give meaning to 40 years of silence and skepticism. She had no way of knowing that such a day was only 3 weeks away, or that it would come from a source she had never expected, in a circumstance she could never have imagined. For now, she drove home to her quiet apartment, carrying the weight of an impossible truth that only she seemed willing to believe. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in late October, mixed in with Margaret's usual collection of medical bills, grocery store advertisements, and credit card offers. The envelope was cream-colored and heavy, with an official seal that made her pause as she sorted through her mail at the small kitchen table that overlooked her apartment complex's parking lot. Margaret's first thought was that it might be related to her ongoing dispute with the Department of Veterans Affairs about her disability rating. For months, she had been trying to get recognition for injuries sustained during her service, only to be told repeatedly that her medical records were incomplete and that many of her claimed service-related conditions couldn't be verified through official channels. She opened the envelope carefully, noting the quality of the paper and the formal letterhead. What she read made her sit down heavily in her kitchen chair, her coffee growing cold as she read the same paragraph 3 times to make sure she wasn't imagining it. The letter was an invitation to a ceremony honoring veterans of classified operations. It was signed by General Patricia Morrison, a name Margaret recognized as someone who had risen to become one of the highest-ranking women in the modern military. The ceremony was to take place at the Pentagon in 2 weeks, and attendance was by invitation only. More surprising than the invitation itself was the specific reference to Operation Midnight Echo, the code name for the extraction mission in Afghanistan that Margaret had mentioned at the veterans meeting. She had never spoken that code name aloud to anyone outside of her former team members, most of whom were dead or had disappeared into lives as anonymous as her own. Margaret read the letter a 4th time, looking for any indication that this might be an elaborate prank or some kind of mistake. But the official seals, the Pentagon letterhead, and the specific operational details all suggested that this was genuine. Someone with access to highly classified information had not only confirmed her service, but had decided it was time to acknowledge it publicly. The letter included a phone number for RSVP and mentioned that transportation and accommodation would be provided for invitees who needed assistance. It also included a security clearance form that needed to be completed and returned within 48 hours, along with a current photograph and emergency contact information. Margaret's hands were shaking slightly as she set the letter down on the table. After 40 years of being dismissed, ignored, and treated like a fantasist, someone in authority had not only validated her service, but was preparing to honor it. The feeling was so overwhelming that she wasn't sure whether to laugh or cry. She called the number immediately, half expecting to reach a disconnected line or a confused receptionist who would tell her there had been some kind of mistake. Instead, she was connected to a crisp, professional voice that confirmed her identity, verified certain details about her service record, and efficiently handled her RSVP. "Ma'am," the voice said, "I want to confirm that you understand this ceremony is specifically for veterans of Operation Midnight Echo and related classified missions. Your attendance means that certain aspects of your service record will become part of the public record for the first time." Margaret felt her breath catch. What does that mean exactly? It means that while the specific operational details will remain classified, your participation in these missions will be officially acknowledged. You'll receive documentation that can be used for veterans' benefits, medical care, and other services that have previously been unavailable to you. The words seemed almost too good to be true. For decades, Margaret had been unable to access proper medical care for service-related injuries because those injuries had occurred during missions that officially never happened. She had been denied disability benefits, mental health services, and even basic recognition at veterans events because her service record appeared incomplete and inconsistent. "There's one more thing, ma'am," the voice continued. "You're authorized to bring one guest to the ceremony. This could be a family member or friend who you'd like to have present when your service is acknowledged." Margaret's first thought was of Sarah, her daughter who had spent years encouraging her to seek help from the VA and wondering why her mother's military experience seemed so different from other veterans. Sarah had never doubted her mother's stories, but Margaret could see the confusion in her daughter's eyes when she tried to explain why there was no documentation, no fellow veterans to corroborate her experiences, no official recognition of her service. After completing the security paperwork and arranging for Sarah to attend as her guest, Margaret spent the next 2 weeks in a state of nervous anticipation unlike anything she had experienced since her military service ended. She found herself going through old photographs and personal items she hadn't looked at in years, trying to prepare herself mentally for the possibility that her 40-year secret might finally see the light. The photographs from Afghanistan were just the tip of the iceberg. Hidden in various places throughout her apartment were documents, letters, and personal effect from a military career that had spanned nearly a decade, but had left almost no official footprint. She had served in places that weren't supposed to exist, with people whose identities remained classified, carrying out operations that would never be mentioned in any public history of American military involvement overseas. Margaret had joined the military straight out of college in 1981, drawn by promises of adventure and the chance to serve her country in meaningful ways. What she hadn't expected was to be recruited, after basic training, into a program that operated outside the normal military structure. The recruitment process itself had been unlike anything she could have imagined. She remembered being called into a meeting with officers whose uniforms bore no identifying information, who asked questions about her psychological profile, her family background, her willingness to spend extended periods away from home with no contact with the outside world. They had been particularly interested in her language skills. She spoke fluent Russian and decent Arabic, abilities that were relatively rare among American military personnel at the time. The training that followed was unlike anything she had experienced in basic military preparation. They learned skills that weren't taught in conventional military schools: how to operate in foreign countries without official diplomatic cover, how to establish and maintain false identities for extended periods, how to extract information from hostile sources without leaving evidence of their presence. Most importantly, they learned how to disappear completely when missions were over, how to return to normal military service or civilian life without any trace of their specialized activities. Margaret had been taught to think of herself as a ghost, someone who could move through dangerous situations and accomplish impossible objectives precisely because no one would ever know she had been there. The Afghanistan extraction had been her third mission, but it was the one that stayed with her most vividly. The operative they had been sent to rescue was a CIA analyst who had been captured while gathering intelligence on Soviet military technology transfers. He had been held in a facility that was technically in Afghanistan, but was actually controlled by Soviet military intelligence. Getting him out had required crossing nearly 200 miles of hostile territory, much of it controlled by Soviet forces or their Afghan allies. Margaret's team had posed as aid workers, journalists, and various other civilian covers as they made their way toward the target location. The actual extraction had taken place during a carefully orchestrated raid that was designed to look like an attack by Afghan resistance fighters. 2 members of her team had been killed during the withdrawal phase of the mission. They had volunteered to stay behind and provide cover for the rest of the team, knowing that they were unlikely to survive, but giving the others a chance to escape with the rescued operative. Their sacrifice had been absolute and anonymous, their deaths reported as training accidents to families who would never know the truth about their loved ones' final moments. Margaret had carried the weight of their deaths for 40 years, unable to honor their memory publicly or even speak their names to anyone who might understand the magnitude of their sacrifice. Michael Torres and Jennifer Walsh had died as ghosts, their heroism known only to the handful of people who had witnessed it and survived. The night before she was scheduled to fly to Washington for the ceremony, Margaret sat in her bedroom looking at a small wooden box that contained the personal effects she had carried during her military service. There were photographs of her team, letters from family members who had worried about her long absences and dangerous assignments, and a medal she had received for the Afghanistan mission, but had never been allowed to wear or acknowledge. The medal was particularly painful to look at. It was a decoration for extraordinary heroism under fire, but it bore no official designation and had never been entered into any military records. It existed in a kind of bureaucratic limbo, simultaneously real and fictional, meaningful and worthless. Sarah arrived early the next morning to drive her mother to the airport, and Margaret could see the mixture of excitement and nervousness in her daughter's face. Sarah had taken time off work and arranged for her own children to stay with their father so she could witness her mother's moment of recognition. "Are you ready for this, Mom?" Sarah asked as they loaded Margaret's suitcase into the car. Margaret considered the question seriously. Was she ready to have her truth acknowledged after 40 years of secrecy and skepticism? Was she ready to see Michael and Jennifer's sacrifice finally honored? Was she ready to step out of the shadows and into a world where her military service could be discussed openly and honestly? "I don't know if anyone could be ready for something like this," Margaret answered honestly. "But I'm grateful it's finally happening." The flight to Washington was Margaret's first time on an airplane in over a decade, and she found herself staring out the window at the landscape passing below, thinking about all the places her military service had taken her that she had never been able to describe to anyone. Countries that had been too sensitive to mention, operations that had been too classified to acknowledge, experiences that had shaped her entire adult life but had remained locked inside her memory. Sarah held her mother's hand during the flight, sensing the weight of emotions that Margaret was carrying. They talked about practical things, what to expect at the ceremony, what Margaret should wear, how they would get from the hotel to the Pentagon. But underneath the logistics was an awareness that this trip represented the end of a very long silence. When they landed at Reagan National Airport, Margaret felt a familiar sense of déjà vu. She had passed through this airport dozens of times during her military career, usually on her way to or from missions that would never appear in any official records. The last time she had been here was in 1989, returning from what would be her final classified operation, a mission in Eastern Europe that had taken place just months before the Berlin Wall came down. A car was waiting for them at the airport, driven by a young military officer who greeted Margaret with a respect that felt almost foreign after years of skepticism and dismissal. The drive through Washington took them past monuments and government buildings that held memories Margaret had never been able to share with anyone. The hotel where they were staying was in Arlington, just across the river from the Pentagon. Margaret's room looked out toward the massive building where her ceremony would take place the next day, and she spent a long time that evening standing at the window, trying to prepare herself mentally for the moment when her impossible story would finally be acknowledged as truth. The phone in her room rang just after 9 o'clock that evening. When Margaret answered, the voice on the other end was crisp and professional, but not unfriendly. Ms. Chun, this is General Morrison's aide. The general would like to meet with you privately tomorrow morning before the ceremony, if that's acceptable to you. Margaret felt her heart rate increase. General Morrison was not just the highest-ranking official at the ceremony. She was also someone whose own military career had involved classified operations and sensitive assignments. The opportunity to speak with her privately felt both thrilling and terrifying. Of course, Margaret replied. What time should I be there? 1000 hours, ma'am. Someone will meet you at the Pentagon entrance and escort you to the general's office. And ma'am, you might want to bring any documentation or personal effects related to your service. The general is very interested in hearing your story in detail. After hanging up the phone, Margaret sat on the edge of her hotel bed, staring at the small wooden box she had brought with her. Inside were the photographs, the unofficial medal, and several other items she had never shown to anyone outside of her former team members. Tomorrow, she would finally have the chance to tell her story to someone who not only had the authority to believe it, but who also had the security clearance to verify it. For the first time in 40 years, Margaret Chun was going to be able to tell the complete truth about her military service to someone who could do something about it. The thought was both liberating and absolutely terrifying. General Patricia Morrison's office was located in one of the most secure sections of the Pentagon, requiring Margaret to pass through multiple security checkpoints and be escorted by armed guards through corridors she had never seen during her previous visits to the building decades earlier. The walls were lined with photographs of military operations, official portraits of senior officers, and maps marking various international deployments. Margaret carried her wooden box of personal effects, her hand steady despite the significance of the moment. Sarah had wanted to come with her, but the private meeting was for Margaret alone. Her daughter was waiting in the hotel, probably pacing nervously and checking her phone every few minutes for updates. The general's aide, a young captain whose uniform was perfectly pressed and whose demeanor suggested extensive experience with high-level meetings, knocked softly on the office door before opening it and announcing Margaret's arrival. General Morrison, Ms. Margaret Chun, is here for your 1000 appointment. Send her in, Captain, and please ensure we're not disturbed for the next hour. Margaret stepped into the office and was immediately struck by its understated elegance. Unlike the intimidating grandeur of some Pentagon offices she had seen, General Morrison's workspace felt more like a comfortable study, with bookshelves lining one wall and natural light streaming through windows that looked out toward Arlington Cemetery. General Patricia Morrison rose from behind her desk as Margaret entered. At 58, she was a commanding presence without being intimidating, her graying hair pulled back in a neat bun, and her uniform bearing the insignia and decorations of someone who had spent over 3 decades in military service. What struck Margaret immediately was the general's eyes. They held the kind of focused intelligence and hard-earned wisdom that came from making life and death decisions in situations most people couldn't imagine. Ms. Chun, the general said, extending her hand. It's an honor to finally meet you. Please have a seat. Margaret shook the general's hand, noting the firm grip and direct eye contact. Thank you, General Morrison. I have to admit, I'm still not entirely sure why I'm here or how you know about my service record. General Morrison smiled slightly as they both sat down in comfortable chairs positioned away from the formal desk area. That's exactly what I'd like to discuss with you. But first, I want you to know that everything we discuss in this room is covered by executive privilege and security classifications that are higher than anything you dealt with during your active service. You can speak freely about any aspect of your military experience without fear of prosecution or security violations. The words felt like a physical weight being lifted from Margaret's shoulders. For 40 years, she had carried the burden of secrets that could theoretically result in treason charges if disclosed improperly. The idea that she could finally speak openly about her experiences was almost overwhelming. Before we begin, General Morrison continued, I'd like you to look at something. The general walked to a secure filing cabinet and removed a thick folder marked with classification stamps and security warnings. She returned to her chair and opened the folder, revealing what appeared to be hundreds of pages of documents, photographs, and official reports. "This is your complete service record," General Morrison explained. "Not the sanitized version that appears in standard military databases, but the actual documentation of your service, including every classified operation you participated in between 1981 and 1989. Margaret stared at the folder with a mixture of amazement and vindication. For decades, she had been told that no such records existed, that her claims of service couldn't be verified through official channels. Yet here was proof that not only had her service been documented, but that the documentation had been preserved and maintained at the highest levels of military classification. "How is this possible?" Margaret asked, her voice barely steady. "I was told repeatedly that there were no records, that my service history was too classified to verify for any purpose." "That's what you were supposed to be told," General Morrison replied. "The security protocols for your type of service required complete deniability at all levels. Even requests from other government agencies or senior military officers would have been denied. Only a handful of people have ever had the clearance and authorization to access these files." The general began turning through pages in the folder, revealing documents that Margaret recognized and others she had never seen. There were mission briefings, after-action reports, psychological evaluations, and detailed accounts of operations that Margaret had never known had been so thoroughly documented. "Operation Midnight Echo," General Morrison said, stopping a section of the file. "September 15th through October 6th, 1983. Six-person team insertion into Soviet-controlled Afghan territory for the extraction of CIA operative David Kowalski, who had been captured while gathering intelligence on Soviet military technology transfers." Margaret felt her breath catch as the general read details that matched her own memories exactly. Dates, names, locations, and operational specifics that she had never discussed with anyone outside her original team. "Team leader, Captain James Morrison," the general continued. "Specialists Margaret Chun, Michael Torres, Jennifer Walsh, Thomas Kim, and Lisa Rodriguez. Mission successful with 2 Kia during extraction phase." "Morrison," Margaret said suddenly, recognizing the name. The team leader was named Morrison. "Are you?" "James Morrison was my brother," General Morrison replied quietly. "He died 3 weeks after the Afghanistan mission, during a training accident that was actually a cover story for another classified operation that went wrong. I've spent most of my career working my way up to a level where I could access these files and understand what really happened to him." The revelation hit Margaret like a physical blow. Captain Morrison had been an exceptional leader, someone who had earned the absolute trust and loyalty of everyone who served under him. His death had been reported as a helicopter crash during routine training, but Margaret had always suspected that the explanation was another cover story designed to protect operational security. "I'm so sorry," Margaret said. "Your brother was one of the best officers I ever served with. He saved all of our lives multiple times during that mission." "I know," General Morrison replied. "I've read the after-action reports. I've also read the recommendations he made regarding your performance during the mission. According to his evaluation, you displayed extraordinary courage under fire and made tactical decisions that were directly responsible for the mission's success." The general turned to another section of the file, revealing documents that Margaret had never seen but which bore her name and service number. "You were recommended for the Distinguished Service Cross for your actions in Afghanistan, but the recommendation was classified at such a high level that the medal could never be officially awarded." Margaret felt tears starting to form in her eyes. The Distinguished Service Cross was one of the highest military decorations for valor, second only to the Medal of Honor. The idea that she had been recommended for such recognition, but that the recommendation had remained buried in classified files for 40 years, was both validating and heartbreaking. "There's more," General Morrison continued, turning through additional pages. "Operation Northern Light, December 1984. Operation Silent Thunder, June 1986. Operation Ghost Protocol, March 1988. You participated in 11 classified missions over 8 years, each one involving significant risk and requiring exceptional skill and dedication. As the general read through the mission names and dates, Margaret felt 40 years of suppressed memories flooding back. Each operation had been unique, challenging, and dangerous in its own way. She had served in countries most Americans couldn't locate on a map, had worked with intelligence operatives from allied nations, had gathered information, and completed objectives that had contributed to American security interests around the world. Why now? Margaret asked. Why are these records being declassified after all this time? General Morrison closed the folder and leaned back in her chair. Several reasons. First, enough time has passed that most of the operational details no longer pose active security risks. The Soviet Union is gone, many of the political situations you were involved in have been resolved, and most of the people who were compromised by your operations are either dead or no longer relevant to current security concerns. The general paused, choosing her words carefully. But, more importantly, there's been a growing recognition at the highest levels of government that veterans like you have been denied proper recognition and benefits for too long. You've carried the burden of classified service without any of the support systems that other veterans take for granted. Margaret thought about the years of frustration trying to access medical care for service-related injuries, the difficulty getting disability benefits for conditions that couldn't be officially connected to her military service, the isolation of being unable to share her experiences with other veterans who might understand what she had gone through. What happens after today? Margaret asked. After the ceremony this afternoon, you'll receive official documentation that acknowledges your service without revealing specific operational details. This will allow you to access veterans' benefits, medical care, and other services that have been unavailable to you. More importantly, you'll no longer have to carry these secrets alone. The general opened the folder again and removed a small box that Margaret hadn't noticed before. Inside the box was a medal that looked similar to the unofficial decoration Margaret had kept hidden for 40 years, but with additional ribbons and official markings. This is the Distinguished Service Cross that should have been awarded to you in 1984, General Morrison said, along with campaign ribbons for the operations you participated in and service decorations that reflect the true scope of your military career. Margaret stared at the medals with an emotion she couldn't quite name. They represented not just recognition of her service, but validation of experiences that had shaped her entire adult life, but had never been acknowledged or honored. I want you to know, General Morrison continued, that your service mattered. The operations you participated in contributed to intelligence gathering that helped end the Cold War, prevented several potential international conflicts, and protected American interests around the world. The fact that your contributions couldn't be publicly acknowledged doesn't diminish their importance. Margaret picked up one of the photographs from the folder, a black and white image that showed her team in Afghanistan just before the extraction mission. They looked young and determined, unaware that 2 of them would be dead within weeks and that the others would carry the secret of their sacrifice for the rest of their lives. I've wondered for 40 years if what we did mattered, Margaret said quietly. Whether the secrecy was worth it, whether the sacrifices Michael and Jennifer made had any lasting impact. They did, General Morrison replied firmly. The operative you extracted from Afghanistan provided intelligence that revealed Soviet military capabilities and intentions that influenced American defense policy for the rest of the decade. Michael Torres and Jennifer Walsh died protecting information that helped keep this country safe. The general closed the folder and stood up, indicating that their private meeting was coming to an end. This afternoon, when you're recognized publicly for your service, remember that you're not just representing yourself. You're representing every veteran who served in classified operations, every person who sacrificed for their country without expectation of recognition or reward. Margaret gathered her wooden box and prepared to leave, feeling lighter than she had in decades. The weight of carrying impossible secrets alone was finally being lifted replaced by the knowledge that her truth was not only believed but honored at the highest levels of military leadership. "General Morrison," Margaret said as she reached the door, "thank you for believing in my story when no one else would." "I didn't have to believe your story, Ms. Chun," the general replied. "I had access to the documentation that proved every word of it was true. What took courage was your willingness to keep telling that story even when no one would listen." As Margaret left the general's office and made her way back through the Pentagon's corridors, she thought about the ceremony that would take place in just a few hours. For the first time in 40 years, she would stand in front of an audience and speak about her military service without fear of being dismissed, disbelieved, or prosecuted. Her impossible truth was finally being acknowledged as the extraordinary reality it had always been. The young captain who had escorted her to the meeting walked alongside her toward the building's exit, maintaining the respectful silence that seemed appropriate for someone who had just witnessed a very long injustice finally being corrected. "Ma'am," the captain said as they reached the final security checkpoint, "if I may say so, it's an honor to meet someone who served the way you did. I hope today gives you some measure of the recognition you've deserved for so long." Margaret smiled, feeling lighter and more hopeful than she had in years. "Thank you, Captain. Today feels like the beginning of something I never thought I'd live to see." The Pentagon Ceremonial Hall was filled with an unusual mix of attendees when Margaret and Sarah arrived that afternoon. Unlike typical military ceremonies, which drew families, fellow service members, and military officials, this gathering included people whose presence suggested the extraordinary nature of the event taking place. Margaret recognized several faces from intelligence agencies, senior military officers whose uniforms bore decorations indicating service in classified operations, and a handful of elderly individuals who carried themselves with the quiet dignity of people who had spent their careers in shadows. These were the witnesses to invisible wars, the participants in operations that had never been officially acknowledged. Sarah helped her mother to their designated seats in the front row, both women dressed in their best formal attire for an occasion they had never imagined would happen. Margaret wore a navy blue dress that complemented the silver in her hair, while Sarah had chosen a black dress that suggested both solemnity and celebration. "How are you feeling, Mom?" Sarah asked quietly as they settled into their seats. Margaret considered the question carefully. After 40 years of carrying secrets that had isolated her from other veterans and made her doubt her own memories, the prospect of public recognition felt surreal. "Nervous," she answered honestly, "but also relieved. I never thought I'd live to see this day." The ceremony began with traditional military protocols. An honor guard presented the colors, a military chaplain offered an invocation, and General Morrison took the podium to address the assembled guests. The general's presence alone lent credibility to the proceedings that would have been impossible to challenge or dismiss. "We gather here today," General Morrison began, "to honor veterans whose service to our nation has remained hidden for decades due to the classified nature of their operations. These men and women serve in places that don't appear on any official maps, carried out missions that never appeared in any public records, and made sacrifices that could never be publicly acknowledged." Margaret felt her heart racing as the general continued speaking. Each word seemed to validate experiences that she had been told were impossible, memories that she had been encouraged to doubt, sacrifices that she had been told were irrelevant. "The individuals we honor today participated in operations that contributed to American national security interests during some of the most dangerous periods in our nation's history. They served without expectation of recognition, without the support systems available to other veterans, and without the ability to share their experiences with families, friends, or fellow service members." The general paused and looked directly at Margaret before continuing. "Today marks the first time that their service is being officially acknowledged, and the first time that they are receiving the recognition they have deserved for far too long." A video presentation followed the general's opening remarks, showing historical footage from the 1980s and providing context for the international situations that had required classified military operations. The images were carefully chosen to suggest the scope and danger of the missions without revealing specific operational details, but Margaret recognized several locations where she had served. Where her own story was presented, Margaret felt Sarah's hand tighten around hers. The presentation included some of the photographs from Margaret's wooden box, which had been cleared for public release by military censors. More importantly, it included maps and timeline information that corroborated every detail of the stories that Margaret had been telling for 40 years. Specialist Margaret Chun, the narrator's voice, explained over images of 1980s Afghanistan, participated in Operation Midnight Echo, a mission to extract a captured American intelligence operative from Soviet-controlled territory. The operation required crossing 200 miles of hostile terrain and resulted in the successful rescue of the operative, though 2 team members were killed during the extraction. Margaret closed her eyes as the presentation continued, remembering Michael Torres and Jennifer Walsh and the way they had volunteered to provide covering fire that they knew would cost them their lives. For the first time since 1983, their sacrifice was being acknowledged publicly, their deaths finally given the meaning they had always deserved. When the video presentation concluded, General Morrison returned to the podium and began calling individual veterans forward to receive their recognition. Each person who approached the stage represented years of invisible service, classified sacrifices, and long-denied validation. Margaret watched as elderly men and women walked slowly to the front of the hall, many of them moving with the careful gait of people whose injuries had never been officially connected to their military service. She recognized the same mixture of pride and relief on their faces that she felt in her own chest. When her name was called, Margaret rose from her seat with Sarah's help and walked toward the stage on legs that felt less steady than usual. The walk seemed to take forever, each step carrying the weight of 40 years of doubt, dismissal, and secrecy. General Morrison was waiting for her at the podium, holding a small wooden box that Margaret recognized as containing the medals she had been shown that morning. But more important than the decorations was the document the general handed her first. This official citation, General Morrison announced to the audience, acknowledges Specialist Margaret Chen's participation in 11 classified operations between 1981 and 1989, including her extraordinary service during Operation Midnight Echo in Afghanistan. Margaret took the document with hands that were steadier than she had expected. The paper felt substantial and official, bearing seals and signatures that would finally allow her to access veteran services and benefits that had been denied to her for decades. For your service above and beyond the call of duty, General Morrison continued, opening the wooden box. You are hereby awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, along with campaign ribbons and service decorations that reflect the true scope of your military career. As the general pinned the medals to Margaret's dress, the audience rose in sustained applause. Margaret looked out at the faces in the ceremonial hall and saw something she had almost forgotten existed: respect for her service, acknowledgement of her sacrifices, and recognition that her impossible story had been true all along. But the most important face in the audience was Sarah's. Margaret's daughter was crying openly, finally, understanding why her mother's military experience had seemed so different from other veterans, why the official records had been incomplete, why her mother had carried such heavy secrets for so many years. When Margaret returned to her seat, Sarah embraced her with an intensity that spoke to years of confusion finally being resolved. "I'm so proud of you, Mom," Sarah whispered. "I always believe your stories, but now I understand why they were so hard for other people to accept." The ceremony continued with the recognition of other veterans, but Margaret found herself thinking about the people who weren't present to witness this moment. Michael Torres and Jennifer Walsh deserve to be standing on that stage, receiving their own recognition for sacrifices that had remained hidden for 40 years. The families who have been told their loved ones died in training accidents deserve to know the truth about their heroism. Most of all, Margaret thought about the veterans who had dismissed her stories at the support group meetings, the VA officials who had denied her benefits because they couldn't verify her service, and all the people who had treated her like a confused elderly woman whose memories couldn't be trusted. As the ceremony concluded and guests began moving toward a reception area, Margaret was approached by several of the other honored veterans. These were people who understood exactly what she had experienced, who had carried their own impossible secrets and endured their own years of disbelief and dismissal. 40 years, said a man named Robert Kim, who had been recognized for operations in Eastern Europe. I was starting to think this day would never come. I stopped trying to tell people about my service years ago, added a woman named Linda Rodriguez, who had participated in missions in Central America. It was easier to let people think I'd had an uneventful military career than to keep fighting to be believed. Margaret found herself part of a group of people who shared experiences that had been literally unspeakable for decades. They compared stories about the frustration of dealing with VA bureaucracy that wasn't designed for their type of service, the isolation of being unable to connect with other veterans who might understand their experiences, and the psychological toll of carrying secrets that had defined their lives but couldn't be acknowledged. The hardest part, Margaret admitted to the group, was feeling like I was the only one. Even when I knew logically that there had to be other people with similar experiences, I'd never met any of them. I started to wonder if maybe I really was remembering things wrong. That was intentional, Robert explained. We were kept separated after our service ended specifically to prevent us from finding each other and comparing notes. The security protocols required complete isolation from anyone who might be able to corroborate our stories. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of several younger military officers who wanted to hear first-hand accounts of operations they had studied in classified military history courses. Margaret found herself answering questions about tactical decisions, operational challenges, and the political context of missions that had been academic subject for people too young to have lived through them. One young officer asked Margaret about the personal cost of carrying classified secrets for so long. How did you maintain your sense of identity when such a significant part of your life experience couldn't be shared with anyone? Margaret considered the question carefully. I think I spent 40 years feeling like I was living a double life, she replied. There was the person I appeared to be, a quiet veteran who'd had an unremarkable military career, and the person I actually was who had participated in operations that most people would find unbelievable. After a while, even I started to wonder which version was real. As the reception continued, Margaret noticed that Sarah was engaged in animated conversation with General Morrison, asking questions about her mother's service that she had never been able to get answered. Margaret could see her daughter finally getting the complete picture of who her mother really was and what she had sacrificed for her country. The drive back to their hotel that evening was quiet, both women processing the weight of what they had witnessed. After 40 years of secrecy and skepticism, Margaret's truth had finally been acknowledged by the highest levels of military leadership in a ceremony that would be documented and remembered. I have to ask you something, Mom, Sarah said as they reached their hotel. All those times when people didn't believe your stories, when they treated you like you were confused or making things up, how did you keep from giving up? Margaret thought about all the VA meetings where she'd been dismissed, all the veterans groups where she'd felt like an outsider, all the times she'd wondered if it would be easier to just stop talking about her military service altogether. I kept going because I knew that Michael and Jennifer deserved to have their sacrifice remembered, she replied. Even if I was the only person who believed it had happened, even if no one would ever officially acknowledge their heroism, I couldn't let their deaths become meaningless. Sarah reached over and took her mother's hand. They're not meaningless anymore, Mom. Today, prove that. Margaret looked out the hotel window toward the Pentagon, where her complete service record was now part of the official military archive, where her story was finally documented as historical fact rather than impossible fantasy. For the first time in 40 years, Margaret Shin could talk about her military service without fear of being dismissed, disbelieved, or prosecuted. Her impossible truth had finally been acknowledged as the extraordinary reality it had always been, and the weight of carrying that truth alone had finally been lifted from her shoulders. 6 months after the Pentagon ceremony, Margaret Chin sat in the same Veterans Affairs meeting room where she had first shared her story, but everything about the atmosphere was different. The skeptical glances and polite dismissal had been replaced by genuine respect and curiosity about her experiences. Word had spread through the veterans community about the classified operations ceremony, and Margaret's presence at the meetings now carried an authority that had been absent before. The monthly support group had grown significantly, drawing veterans from across the region who wanted to hear from someone whose impossible service had been officially validated. But, more importantly, it had attracted other veterans who had begun to wonder if their own dismissed stories might deserve a second look. Margaret had brought copies of the official documentation she'd received from General Morrison, not to prove her credibility again, but to help other veterans understand what types of evidence might exist for their own service. The distinction between classified operations and conventional military service had become a focus of the group's discussions, with Margaret serving as an informal guide to navigating the complex bureaucracy of declassification and recognition. "I received a letter yesterday," announced Tom Rodriguez, the former Marine who had been among Margaret's strongest skeptics 6 months earlier. "It's from the Department of Defense, asking for additional information about operations I participated in during my second tour in Afghanistan." Margaret looked up from the notes she'd been reviewing. Over the past months, she had helped several group members request reviews of their service records, particularly those who had participated in operations that seemed to fall outside normal military documentation. "What kind of operations?" she asked. Tom hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with sharing details he had been conditioned to keep secret. "We call them unofficial reconnaissance missions. We would cross into Pakistani territory to gather intelligence on Taliban supply routes and training camps. We were told that if we were captured, our presence couldn't be officially acknowledged." The room fell silent as Tom described operations that bore remarkable similarities to the kind of classified missions Margaret had participated in decades earlier. Cross-border operations with no official documentation, missions that would be denied by higher command if they went wrong, activities that existed in the gray areas of international law and military protocol. "How many of these missions did you participate in?" Margaret asked. 17 over the course of 13 months, Tom replied. "But none of them appear in my official service record. While I try to get information about them from the VA, I'm told there's no documentation of any such operations." Margaret nodded, recognizing the familiar pattern of denial and bureaucratic stonewalling that she had experienced for decades. "The difference between your situation and mine might be timing," she explained. "My operations took place during the Cold War, when classification periods were much longer. Your missions in Afghanistan might still be considered too politically sensitive to acknowledge officially." She had learned much about the declassification process during her months of working with military historians and intelligence officials who had contacted her after the Pentagon ceremony. The decision to acknowledge classified operations involved complex considerations of current political relationships, ongoing security concerns, and the potential diplomatic impact of revealing previously secret activities. "But that doesn't mean the documentation doesn't exist," Margaret continued. "It might just mean that it's still buried in classified files that won't be accessible for years or decades." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Jennifer Walsh, the support group facilitator who had developed a much deeper understanding of classified military service since Margaret's story had been validated. Jennifer had spent months researching the legal and bureaucratic pathways available to veterans seeking recognition for classified operations, and she had become an advocate for policy changes that would provide better support for this unique population. "I have some updates that might be relevant to our discussion," Jennifer announced. The Department of Veterans Affairs has established a new office specifically for veterans of classified operations. It's designed to provide services and support to people whose military service doesn't fit into conventional categories. Margaret felt a surge of hope at this news. One of her goals since the Pentagon ceremony had been to ensure that other veterans wouldn't have to endure the 40 years of isolation and dismissal that she had experienced. The creation of specialized VA services represented exactly the kind of institutional change that was needed. More importantly, Jennifer continued, they're actively reviewing service records from the past 30 years to identify veterans who might be eligible for reclassification or additional recognition. Tom, your file might already be under review. The possibility that his service might be officially acknowledged seemed to overwhelm Tom with emotion. Margaret watched him process the same mixture of hope and disbelief that she had felt when she first received the invitation to the Pentagon ceremony. I never thought this would be possible, Tom said quietly. I've spent years feeling like I couldn't relate to other veterans because my experiences were so different from anything they understood. Margaret knew exactly what he meant. The isolation of carrying impossible secrets was something that could only be understood by people who had lived through it. The most important thing, she told him, is that you're not alone anymore. There are more of us than any of us realized. After the meeting concluded, Margaret was approached by Lisa, the young veteran who had been sitting quietly during Margaret's first attempt to share her story months earlier. Lisa had become a regular attendee at the meetings, but she had never spoken about her own military service in any detail. Margaret, Lisa said hesitantly, I was wondering if I could talk to you privately sometime about some experiences I had during my deployment that I've never been able to discuss with anyone. Margaret recognized the careful language that Lisa was using. The reluctance to provide specific details, the emphasis on experiences that couldn't be discussed, the obvious discomfort with sharing information that might be classified, all of it suggested that Lisa might have participated in operations similar to those that Margaret and Tom had described. Of course, Margaret replied. Would you like to get coffee sometime this week? They arranged to meet at a quiet cafe near Margaret's apartment, far from the formal environment of the VA building where sensitive conversations might be overheard. Margaret had learned to be careful about where and how she discussed classified military service, even now that her own experiences have been officially acknowledged. The conversation with Lisa 3 days later revealed another story of service that existed outside conventional military categories. Lisa had been a communications specialist who had been recruited for temporary assignments that involved intercepting and analyzing enemy communications in Iraq and Afghanistan. The work had required her to operate in forward positions that were officially unmanned, gathering intelligence that would never be attributed to American sources. I was told that my presence in these locations was so sensitive that it could never be officially acknowledged, Lisa explained. If I was captured or killed, my family would be told that I died in a vehicle accident or some other cover story that wouldn't reveal the true nature of my work. Margaret listened to Lisa's account with a growing sense of recognition. The patterns were the same as those she had experienced decades earlier. Specialized recruitment based on specific skills, operations that existed outside normal military channels, and absolute requirement for secrecy that continued long after the missions were completed. Have you ever tried to get official recognition for this service? Margaret asked. Lisa shook her head. I wasn't sure it was worth trying. After listening to your story at the meetings, I started to wonder if there might be documentation somewhere, but I didn't know how to find it or who to ask. Margaret had brought a folder containing information about the new VA office for veterans of classified operations, along with contact information from military historians who specialized in recent conflicts. Over the past months, she had become an informal resource for veterans seeking to understand and document their own classified service. The political situation is different now than it was during my era, Margaret explained. Operations in Iraq and Afghanistan are much more recent, and many of the security concerns that led to classification are still relevant. But that doesn't mean your service won't eventually be acknowledged. She handed Lisa several documents, including forms for requesting service record reviews and contact information for legal advocates who specialized in veterans affairs. The most important thing is to start the process now, even if it takes years to get results. Every piece of documentation you can provide helps establish the record that will eventually be needed for official recognition. Over the following weeks, Margaret found herself consulting with an increasing number of veterans who were discovering that their dismissed or forgotten military experiences might be worthy of official acknowledgement. Each conversation revealed new patterns of classified service that had been hidden within the broader narrative of recent American military involvement overseas. Some had participated in intelligence-gathering operations that crossed international borders without official diplomatic authorization. Others had been involved in training programs for foreign military forces that couldn't be publicly acknowledged due to political sensitivities. Still others had served in advisory roles that would have been controversial if revealed to the American public or international community. What they all shared was the experience of carrying secrets that had isolated them from other veterans and prevented them from accessing appropriate support services. Many had struggled with service-related injuries or psychological conditions that couldn't be properly treated because the circumstances that caused them couldn't be officially discussed. Margaret began organizing informal meetings for these veterans, providing a space where people could share experiences without fear of judgment or disbelief. The gatherings grew quickly, drawing participants from across several states who were eager to connect with others who understood the unique challenges of classified military service. "What we're creating here," Margaret told the group during one of their monthly meetings, "is something I wish had existed 40 years ago. A community of people who understand that military service comes in many forms, and that some of those forms require different kinds of support and recognition." The group had begun working collectively to advocate for policy changes that would provide better services for veterans of classified operations. They had submitted proposals to congressional representatives, written letters to VA administrators, and provided testimony to military committees about the gaps in existing veteran support systems. Margaret's role in these efforts had evolved from sharing her personal story to helping others understand the broader implications of hidden military service. She had become a recognized expert on the declassification process, the bureaucratic challenges faced by veterans of classified operations, and the long-term psychological impact of carrying military secrets. The work was demanding and sometimes emotionally exhausting, but it gave meaning to experiences that had seemed purposeless for so long. Margaret finally understood why she had survived when Michael Torres and Jennifer Walsh had not, why she had been chosen to carry their story forward, and why her impossible truth had eventually been acknowledged. Sarah had become deeply involved in her mother's advocacy work, using her professional skills to help organize events, manage communications, and coordinate with other veterans' families. The shared mission had strengthened their relationship in ways that Margaret had never expected, transforming years of confusion and concern into a partnership based on mutual respect and common purpose. "I finally understand what your military service meant," Sarah told her mother during one of their planning sessions. "Not just what you did, but what it cost you to do it, and what it's taken for you to help others understand their own experiences." Margaret looked around her apartment, which had been transformed into an informal headquarters for veterans seeking recognition for classified service. The walls were covered with timelines, contact lists, and documentation requirements. Her kitchen table was stacked with case files from veterans across the country who had reached out for assistance. It was a far cry from the quiet, isolated existence she had maintained for 40 years. Instead of carrying her secrets alone, she was now part of a growing community of people whose hidden service was finally being acknowledged and honored. The phone rang that evening as Margaret was reviewing a case file from a veteran who had served in Somalia during operations that had never been publicly acknowledged. The caller was General Morrison, who had remained in contact with Margaret since the Pentagon ceremony. "Margaret," the general said, "I wanted to let you know that the documentary about classified operations veterans is moving forward. The producers are hoping to interview you about your experiences and the advocacy work you've been doing." Margaret had been approached several months earlier about participating in a documentary that would examine the broader issue of hidden military service throughout American history. The project represented an opportunity to reach a much wider audience with the message that military sacrifice came in many forms, including some that remained invisible for decades. "I'm honored to participate," Margaret replied. "But I want to make sure that Michael and Jennifer's story is told properly and that people understand this isn't just about individual recognition. It's about creating systems that support all veterans, regardless of whether their service fits into conventional categories." "That's exactly the message the documentary wants to convey," General Morrison assured her. "Your story has become a symbol of something much larger than any individual experience. It represents the thousands of veterans whose service has been hidden or dismissed, and the need for institutions that can recognize and honor all forms of military sacrifice." After hanging up the phone, Margaret sat at her kitchen table looking at the photograph from Afghanistan that had started her journey toward recognition 4 decades earlier. Michael Torres and Jennifer Walsh smiled back at her from the grainy black and white image, young and determined and unaware of the legacy their sacrifice would eventually create. Their deaths had not been meaningless after all. Their story had become part of a larger narrative about hidden heroes, classified sacrifice, and the importance of ensuring that no veteran's service is forgotten or dismissed simply because it doesn't fit into conventional understanding. Margaret Shun had spent 40 years carrying an impossible truth that no one would believe. Now that truth had become the foundation for a movement that was changing how America understood and honored military service, ensuring that other veterans would never have to endure the isolation and dismissal that she had experienced. The woman whose record had been mocked for decades had become the voice for thousands of hidden heroes whose stories were finally being told. Her impossible truth had proven to be the most important truth of all, that some sacrifices are too significant to remain secret forever, and that courage and heroism exist in forms that most people never imagine.